From Minneapolis, Minnesota, welcome to Playwright Center's Theater Begins Here.
Today, theater begins with Adaptations. But first, a membership highlight on classes and seminars. We offer one-night and multi-week educational opportunities on a variety of topics. Join us via Zoom from anywhere in the world. Check out our offerings at pwcenter.org/classes. And now, on to the show.
We are so excited to have our special guest today, Emilio Williams, join us. Emilio is a bilingual Spanish and English award-winning writer and educator. His critically acclaimed plays have been produced in Argentina, Estonia, France, Mexico, Spain, the United Kingdom, and the United States, including New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C. Emilio has lectured around the world and taught at several U.S. universities, including DePaul University, Columbia College, Chicago, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and Georgia State University. He holds a BA in film and video and an MFA in writing. He is a resident playwright at Chicago Dramatists, where he is also a faculty member. This fall, Teatro Vista will present the world premiere of his play, Bernarda, at Steppenwolf Theater in Chicago. Welcome, Emilio.
Hi, thanks for having me. So great to see you.
Yeah, so we're going to just jump right in with my favorite question is, how did your theatrical journey begin?
Oh, wow. All right. I think since I was a kid, both playing in the living room, in the bedrooms, pretending to be people, playing with friends, and then in a more formal, traditional theatrical way, I was very lucky that my parents were aficionados and they will bring me with them. I mean, I remember first not going with them and seeing my parents dressed up in Madrid to go to the theater at night with their friends, and how glamorous going to the theater was, and how I felt I was missing out and having to stay home. And then eventually, as there were plays that were appropriate for me, and I was getting older, they started bringing me with them. So I was very lucky to grow up in a family where theater was an important part of our lives.
So adaptation, not everybody does adaptations. Can you tell us about—
Sorry, everybody does adaptations. There's nothing new under the sun.
Okay, you know what? You're absolutely right.
Some are giving credit to what they're taking, they're stealing from, and some are not.
I stand corrected. How did you get interested in adapting plays?
Oh, so I guess an ongoing feeling with the classics. I feel some of the classics were like these ex-boyfriends who text you in the middle of the night. This kind of love-hate relationship. They're hunting, you cannot avoid them. And at the same time, they can be so annoying in the way they're presented, or in the way they may have been, maybe exaggerated in its importance, or treated like one of my themes, for example, is like how they're treated as sacred cows that you have to respect, right? Instead of being playful, right? The idea, again, going to playing a play, players, the idea of theater as being playful. And so I always come back to the classics, both as a ticker buyer, as a reader, as a teacher, and as a writer as well. So always something to have in conversation with them, right? Because no matter how much we may complain about how the canon is like, one way, it tends to be straight, white, male, blah, blah, as much as we can complain about that, the truth is, like, all these canonical classic plays, they all have something, right? At the same time, that is worth recovering, or worth, at the very least, entering conversation with.
Mm-hmm. So I really love the way that you talk about adaptation, because a lot of people just assume it's you just take all the beats of a story and then just change the time period. But you talk about it in such a really great way of saying to adapt and subvert traditional plots and storytelling conventions to refresh the classics in a way that make them relevant to our present day. And that's just such a very strong mission of an adaptation, of making it relate and resonate with today's audiences, and then also just storytelling structures and different ways that you can manipulate the narrative. Can you just talk a little bit more about that and kind of give examples and how you attack that for yourself?
Well, yeah, because there's many degrees of adaptation, right? I'm thinking out loud here by thinking about maybe someone who is getting very close to the original source, and then someone that can go really far away from the original source to the point that there is not even a credit to it. As I was saying before, right? Something that is inspiring or rhymes or resonates with something, right? So I think looking back at my own writing, I've been very close and I've been very far. And those are very different ways of thinking about adaptation or being inspired by the classics. So I don't know, maybe we can talk if you're very, very close, right? The adaptation tends to be more respectful in some way. I mean, I don't like that because I think sometimes going away from the original is the best thing that you can do for the original playwright in a way, but I would say more literal interpretations or adaptations. Of course, we had this situation as playwright, right? When Peter Brooks comes on board in the 60s and 70s, and all these directors as the stars start getting Shakespeare and make their own staging of them, they freed up what you could be doing with a classic, right? And my point is, like, if directors can do that, why can we not do that as playwrights as well with the original material, right? And as a matter of fact, I think the tools and the craft of a playwright are usually better matched to take an old text and change it, or I would say fix it, but change it or adapt it. So those, going very close would be, you follow obviously that structure or whatever it is, and then as you move in the spectrum, you may start, for example, something that directors have been doing with Shakespeare for decades, is streamlining, which is cutting to the chase or shutting down passages that are just too wordy or long or you don't really need, making it in a way the classic more understandable. We almost never produce a Shakespeare the way was intended in terms of length, for example. So streamlining is very common, and most audience members may not notice, and that's a good thing, right? But the truth is, like, we should not lie to ourselves about the fact that we are not seeing Shakespeare the way it is on the original text. So more adaptations. So for example, one of the things that I've done in the past is compositing characters from the original. For example, in this adaptation coming up of Garcia Lorca, the Bernarda play, and I changed the title on purpose because I'm taking so many liberties. But for example, in the House of Bernarda Alba, there's 5 daughters. And for me, one of the daughters was not doing enough. So I composed her character with a housekeeper who is called criada, which is literal housekeeper. And it doesn't have even a proper name. And I gave her a proper name. And I gave her a lot of the business functions of that one sister that now has disappeared. And it's the sister that nobody kind of remember. So for me, it was just like taking air from the main story. So that's something else that you could be doing. You can, as you mentioned, you can change the time period. You can change, in this case, for example, instead of making a very literal understanding of a rural southern town in Spain in the 1930s, is more a mythological time. Is a non-specific time and place rooted in Catholic Hispanic roots. So, and that's, by the way, something the Greeks did, right? So I just thought of this, all the Greek tragedies are really adaptations to begin with, because these were mythologies that were in the Athenian culture. And all these stories were not from their time. So Electra, Medea, Orestes, all these great characters and stories were set up in a mythological time where the gods were still more present in the lives of the Greeks, according to them. So they were not in the real time and place of ancient Greeks. They were in this mythological time. And therefore, it gives more freedom, right, of how a mythological time looks like or feels like or smells like and tastes like and all those things. So I think that like decontextualizing from the original or changing the context is another way that we're going through the spectrum, and we're making more and more different at this point, right? And then how far you go from original dialogue, for example. So one of the things I was doing with the Lorca project, I was very carefully, because I love the play, but I also think the original, but I think that there is this sacred cow syndrome with it, of always trying to be so respectful to it and so literal and so intense to the point of making it more boring for me than it is the original. So I would look at a scene, and I think Lorca was a very funny gay man, and I was trying to find what is he trying to do on the scene, right? And then trying to do the best job on trying to accomplish that goal for us today in Chicago, right? So for example, if I noticed that he was using humor for whatever function, then I will do something humorous that will create that function, but it would be a different gag or more exaggerated or different, right? So in a way, that's what I was saying also at the beginning, that you can be more respectful by being farther away from the original text, because in a way I'm kind of respecting what he was trying to accomplish, and I'm helping to get that accomplished in Chicago in 2023, right?
I love this because it also harkens back to our last podcast episode, which we had with Wendy Weckworth around translation, and talking about the exact same thing, like what is the intention in the scene, rather than trying to just respect the lines of text.
Mm-hmm.
So I love.
And even beyond, so Lorca has this huge problem. So the original Garcia Lorca has this beautiful poetic language that is, so for example, he does something in Spanish that is a combination of proverbs that are true from the time with invented proverbs that are very poetical. And the Anglo translations through the decades have got it wrong, because they couldn't, they were trying to be, when they were literal, they didn't make sense. When they were too poetic, it sounded corny. I'm sorry to say, it wasn't working. So what I was trying to do with this is, like, how, for example, I remember one time in Spain, a British colleague said, "Oh, you guys are so lucky that you can see Shakespeare in Spanish, because you don't have to deal with the language. You can actually just enjoy the characters and the plot." Wow. And that always made me think, right? It's so incredible, the plots. And that's why you get them in every culture, right? The adaptations of Shakespeare, because the plots and the characters are so thrilling. But the old language sometimes can get on the way for contemporary audiences. So what I did with Lorca is actually kind of downgrade the poetics to really focus on the action and the characters. And what we did is that there's 3 generations of women in this house. The grandmother speaks more in Spanish from Lorca. The mother speaks in English and has some Lorca on it, and the senior housekeeper. But then the newer generation are going farther away from Lorca as well, and the poetic language, and they're more day-to-day in their English, right? And I think that was a way also to do some character development that hopefully will work. Yeah, but the idea, like, sometimes translators are trying to be so close to reflecting the language that then it just doesn't work for me.
Yeah, but but how cool that translation and adaptation have this sort of similar questions that they ask of themselves as writers and of the text as they're moving through, and how you navigate those questions around, what is the scene trying to do, and how am I trying to engage the audience that I'm writing for right now.
Absolutely.
You've talked about the play you're working on right now. Are there other plays that you have adapted that you'd like to share with us? And have you had moments around any of these plays where you've had pushback around the way that you did your adaptation, or things that really brought people into a play that they hadn't seen before, or that engaged them in a new way?
Yeah, so I think the Lorca one for the fall is the closest to a more traditional adaptation. And I think I'm very interested. I think the Lorca hardcore scholars are going to leave the house with their hair on fire. which I'm okay with, as long as it's not literal, metaphorically. But I think the audience is gonna really respond, and I care about that more. But more on that, I've been doing what, and I taught a class with this topic for you guys once, poking the canon, right? So what I'm doing is more than a translation. I'm playing with the classic in a way. I know that Hannah, during COVID, you came to see my 3.5 Sisters play.
Yes, which
it,
I hoped you'd bring up because I loved that. I loved it.
Thank you. You were so supportive, and I remember at a time that we were so sick of Zoom at that point that we thought we'll never ever do Zoom ever again because we were so tired, and you were so generous by coming and giving your reaction. And that one is really far, right? Like the play is about three sisters during COVID in isolation with a lot of Chekhovian themes, and they Zoom with a grandfather, which bases in another character of a novella from Chekhov. So that's another thing you can compose it in these adaptations. And then nothing was directly from 3.5 Sisters until the ending that was common in the text for both my play and the original Three Sisters. Right, so that's another hybrid, interesting way of adapting. It hasn't opened yet because of all the delays, but we have had readings in the US and Spain, and it's still kind of under development. So I'm hoping more movement will be taking that. I have a lot of interest maybe in London. So I think more things are going to happen with that adaptation or version or original play inspired by, I don't know how to even call it. Other than that, I've been also being inspired by genres. I did a parody and a tribute to romantic comedies called Tables and Beds. And it wasn't directly an adaptation of one play, but it was an adaptation of a genre, I would say. And then the other one that was more literally an adaptation would be my play, Medea's Got Some Issues, which was a one-woman comedy of Medea explaining herself and explaining to the audiences why she had to do what she had to do. And not to spoil too much, but basically Jason was a dickhead, so she had to do what she had to do. And it was like almost like a stand-up comedy routine. But there were these elements that at times the actress will become a character in a roundtable discussion about Medea. So there would be these three professors through the play that will comment on the play and on Medea as well. And then she will play all the roles. And it was a really fun show. I was very lucky because actually one of the most wonderful things as a playwright that can happen to you is when different people do the same play. And you see how different your own play can be is really fascinating. So I had an actress in Spain. There was then a Spanish actress who did it in New York. And then there was an American actress who did it in DC and Chicago. So it was so different, right, in between all those versions as well. And then it's a play that gets adapted to the site, the actress, and the time. So there's references to the day the play takes. So it's specific to time and site. So that's interesting too, right? It's an adaptation that continues to be adapted every day as well. So that's really fun.
I love that.
Yeah, those are some of the ideas. Another play of mine is Smartphones, a pocket-sized farce. Wasn't an adaptation, but was a spoof of theater of the absurd, surrealism, but with the way we behave with cell phones and the lack of communication and all those things. But it was a farce, but with a lot of references directly to Waiting for Godot and Wicklow and those classics. And I particularly on that play, I reference to Luis Buñuel, also from Spain, a filmmaker that I love. One was The Exterminating Angel, which is a Mexican movie he made about a group of people. There's upper class people are having dinner, and all of a sudden the dinner finishes and they're not able to leave the house, but nobody knows why. It's a really surreal. So I got very inspired by that. I mentioned it out loud on the play. It was checked, quoted. And then another movie he did, The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeois, it's a fantastic surreal movie. So I was very inspired by how I feel our lives have become so surreal and absurd that are really like an avant-garde play. That was kind of the thing. So what is the absurdity of a day-to-day life? So in that case, I don't know, I guess I was adapting or stealing or quoting from 4 or 5 pieces that I really love of theater and movies. Yeah,
That's so cool. Like I think it's easy to think you're adapting one thing. So seeing how you pull in these other things is really beautiful.
Yeah. And it's funny because when you were teaching for us, I was sitting in on the class and like was even working on my own thing on the side. And Sweeney Todd was the one that I was interested in kind of adapting, but then I ended up abandoning and like combining a bunch of things. But there's this new show, and I have like told everyone about it. And it's a new TV show called The Horrors of Dolores Roach. Have you heard of it?
Oh, it sounds great.
Oh, it makes me so mad because I'm just like, how has this not happened earlier? Why was I not the writer for this? I mean, it would have been a little different with me, but it's basically Sweeney Todd with empanadas.
Oh, yes.
Oh my gosh. I died when I watched the first episode. I love this show.
What's the platform?
It's is it on Amazon Prime? I think it's Amazon Prime.
Cool.
So anybody that's listening needs to go watch that show because it's so brilliant. Like, obviously it's not like exactly Sweeney Todd, but all the big points are right there. And I just think it's a really good example of adaptation. And I'm obsessed with it and like blew through it, I think in like 2 days. It's 8 episodes. Yeah. But you had already started talking about Bernarda and how you kind of switched one of the sisters. Do you think that any of the other adjustments that you've made, and you can talk about those as well, have changed any themes that are in the original, or have, I don't know, added new elements?
So I don't actually, that's the beauty of, I mean, I'm very happy with what Wendy Mateo, the director, is doing and the way he's seeing this. I don't think he does, but I think I may have brought some of them more to the forefront. When you're streamlined, you remove certain things and some other ones. But, you know, the incredible thing about Lorca is that original play talks about isolation. It talks about the lack of bodily autonomy on women under the Catholic, which can be very parallel at times with the Puritan traditions as well. So the idea that a woman didn't have control over her sexuality, fertility in a way, but I have that less in this one version. There is a touch, for example, one of the cleaning ladies mentioned that the father, before he died, had touched her. So there is a little bit of Me Too there moment, definitely class issues. And as a gay man, he was really coding into female characters like Tennessee Williams would do in the US, his longings and his themes of sexual repression and everything else. But, you know, a lot of these incredible gay men wrote some of the most incredible female characters ever, right? Because they were able to project their own repressions and longings again and into female characters, and that way they protected themselves, but also they made them more acceptable for everybody at their time. But it's interesting, right, to think about how some of these women end up being the most interesting female characters written, and they were gay men really talking about their moms and their sisters and about themselves in the female pronouns, so the female form. Yeah.
It's really powerful. You've talked a little bit about this, but what are some things that excite you most about adaptation? And what do you feel like adaptation allows that maybe, you know, one doesn't have if they're writing a straight play? Although, as we established, or you established at the top, everything is adaptation. So maybe this question is moot.
No, so I think for me, what makes me the most exciting is make them more fun, you know, like remove the dandruff, remove the dust, and make super fun theatrical experiences so we can enjoy the classics and not feel like we're eating the broccoli by going, right? Like we have to go. And that's what my favorite part of it is. It's like, oh my God, we thought we were coming. I mean, when anybody gives me that feedback or like, oh, I was coming to the theater today and I was reading it and then I had so much fun, or it was such a great night. That's my favorite, right? Because some people still go to the theater as part of a cultural fair that they feel they need to do instead of something that you should be looking forward to.
Yeah.
We are all to blame as theater artists for that situation because we put our audiences through so much unnecessary boredom.
I also, as an audience member, love how I come into something that, is an adaptation with my own set of thoughts about what I might see, or just memories of whatever the, original is. And as you're saying, that surprise element of it is so engaging and adds like the layers of what you know and then don't know are going to happen are such a fun balance as an audience member.
And there is an added value for the playwrights listening, like my agent Elaine Devlin was mentioning, that right now, unfortunately, in the US, with the crisis we're going through, right, of the regional theaters cutting down on number of shows, bottlenecks of COVID, One of the things she was mentioning is like their producers and commercial, non-for-profit, all kinds, are not so much looking at new material, but they're looking to material that people can recognize something about what they're doing. So there's two ways you can do that, right? You can have a super famous actor, and therefore there is an aspect of recognition and a star system that would make people go to see that one actor, or people would be gravitating to something that sounds like something they may know or have a reference or something. So I think commercially is making sense to be thinking about, for whoever is worrying about the commercial aspects. Like for me, it's never been about that, but I also see why this Bernarda show that I started working way before COVID, it has the perfect time and place and commercial value right now, because there is incredible generations of Latina actresses in Chicago who everybody's gonna love seeing on these roles, right? But that happens. That's not something that you strategize with. But for those strategizing, which is wonderful, and I encourage every playwright to strategize and do whatever it takes to make your practice sustainable and feasible, I think this is definitely a moment to be thinking about how can you add to the conversations with the classics.
A great point.
How do you determine what you want to adapt? And just thinking about all genres, so not just plays, but novels or films or a poem. How do you think about adapting something that is not necessarily theatrical or originally meant for the stage?
Okay, so yeah, I think two questions. So I'm going to answer the second one. Is like how to make something theatrical. Thank you for asking that, because one of the things when I first came to the United States that I felt is that a lot of these quote unquote realistic American theater, and I say quote unquote because for me, there is nothing realistic about it, felt like a made for TV movie of the old days. It didn't feel theatrical, right? So the characteristics of this kind of theater, right? The audience is ignored, like they're pretending I'm not there. And I'm like a fly on the wall, listening to these people talking. They're in a living room or a kitchen with a dishwasher that works. Everything is literal, right? And they're people we know. They tend to be middle class. They tend to be white. There is this structure of the well-made play where there is this surprise that, everybody, it's basically a lot of this place. It's about, I would describe this kind of American theater as people get in a house and scream at each other is basically the master plot of that. So always my interest in the theater has been totally opposite to that. Is like, what does theater do that is different from anything else? Like, what can your play do or your show do that is not a Netflix play and is not a poem, is not a novel, is not an essay, right? And that's something I work on the classroom a lot, and that I always challenge myself to figure out how you can be more theatrical, and actually how can you free yourself up from those conventions of the old style of American white theater or Anglo theater or mainstream theater that was so literal in their ways. And that kind of theater had many advantages. One of them is like it usually does for very juicy roles for actors, and is very adaptable to movies and TV shows, right? So that's why so many of these plays were so famous, because of the movie adaptation that was fairly feasible to make, because they're not theatrical in that way. So so that's the one about theatricality. And the first one, how do I decide what I adapt? Yeah, I have no idea. So another thing too, as part of this kind of like understanding theater as, oh, you write your first plot point at this point, and this is the structure, and then you have a climax, and then you have this very color by numbers concepts of the structure, which I use, but I also subvert as much as I can, right? On that same tradition, there is this tradition that we can rationally fix a script, or the part of the brain that is analytical and critical can fix a script or make the script better and all that. All those are biases. And it's based on this idea that, and I see this all the time, authors get interviewed and, and they give this self-importance by trying to say that they're in control of their process in any way, or, that is, all these are rational choices that I made. And if that's the case for them, I'm glad for them, and I'm kind of sorry for them as well in certain ways. But what I'm going with all this is that there's a lot of part of the process, any creative process, that is very unconscious. I don't remember writing a lot of the scenes I've written, or when I was writing them, or the plays, or what was happening, or what was in my head. I know this sounds crazy, but I'm just typing voices that I'm here many times when you're on the page. And many actors, playwrights who have been on that wave of writing can explain to you that happens. You just hear these voices and you're just typing. So how do you get credit for that? Or how do you explain why that happened? Or, so sometimes in talkbacks, why is so-and-so doing so-and-so? Well, I have no idea. It came, and I feel so many of my colleagues having this pressure of changing their plays and their unconscious and beautiful intuitive choices, to the point that they end up making, through workshop process and fixing, killing the soul of the play. So I think the soul of the play, and just closing the answer, the long winding answer, the soul of the reason why you made the adaptation of the soul of the play, it doesn't have a choice. It doesn't have to be something rational and a decision-making process. It can be something that you can help yourself, or something that just comes up, or something that, wow, you're watching something, is like, oh my God, this has to do with what I'm writing in some way, right? And I think we all have to welcome that. And in the process, we need to make sure that when people are trying to, quote unquote, fix our plays or make them more prepared for conventional production, that we don't lose those moments of intuition that we don't even know where they came from. So in talkbacks, I'm always ready to do this, like, oh, what does he mean when or why is she eating a pineapple? And I would say, well, I don't know. Why was she eating a pineapple? What do you think? I'm ready to throw it back because I have no idea why she was eating a pineapple. But I love the pineapple, and I like the idea of the shape of the pineapple. And I think the pineapple should be there, right? To honor that process of, I don't know where the hell the pineapple came from.
Yeah, I definitely think with adaptation, a thing that's really hard with writing, especially if somebody wants a more literal adaptation, is not just transposing. I guess in film, it would be like shot for shot of each thing, because then you're just replicating an old thing. And where are you in that? That's just you kind of doing data entry instead of using your creative muscle to add your voice into it. And I really love how you said healing the soul of the play and just feeling that out and kind of exploring it. I think that a lot of people with adaptation can fall into the trap of transposing. And so what are ways that you kind of avoid that, or would tell somebody that's a little bit greener how to avoid that?
Yeah, so I think you have to lose the idea of the respect is the literal, right? Like the respect can be doing the best that you can for this play. I think that's the ultimate respect for the original playwright and the original play. So free yourself as anything related to writing. If you, I think this is from Bukowski poem, like if you need to ask for someone's opinion, you're not ready. I mean, so much of what blocks us as writers is this censor, right? That is telling us, oh, what the hell are you doing? Nobody's going to like this. Or who do you think you are to write a play? Right? So overcoming all that is also like, oh my God, how can you do this to Hamlet? Or how can you do this to Lorca? Or, you have to overcome that and free yourself. And if it's in the public domain, is yours to do whatever you want with it.
That leads us to another question that is less maybe fun and creative, but it's around copyright. So public domain, obviously, that's you can use whatever you want from there. What kinds of issues do people come into, challenges around copyright if they're trying to utilize?
Well, I think the rule here is if something is copyrighted, you're working with material that is not in the public domain. I highly recommend you don't start writing anything without getting the permissions, because you're setting up yourself for disaster. Unless you're going so far from it that, like Dolores and her empanadas, right? You're going so far from it that you cannot be accused of plagiarism. But otherwise, I would say do not get into why to even start working on something that you don't have a right to do, right? You're setting up yourself for disaster. So, for the most part, intellectual property, so you're talking about playwrights not in the US, or for the most part, playwrights are very willing to do that, right? So, and then, as you know, there is this fair use related to parody and farce. You can always make a parody. That's another way to get around these copyright issues if you want to be more literal about one material that exists. But I would say why to write, like, it's not something that really inspires me for the most part to be writing things that are so close to us that are not in the public domain. I think for me, I'm more interested in talking to the past and see where we are today compared to that past. Otherwise, write your own. See what are the themes that attract you, see what are you trying to say, what is that show, play, novel doing for you, and how can you do that through your own universe. I think that's much more interesting.
You mentioned writing parodies and spoofs. Can you kind of give a quick and dirty distinction between an adaptation versus a parody, and why it's a little bit safer to do a parody of?
It's a legal thing, I think, related to some Supreme Court decisions, where a parody of something is free speech because you're mocking something, right? So very famously now there is a show around the country called The Empire Strips Back, which is a burlesque show inspired by The Empire Strikes Back. But Lucas couldn't go back and sue because it's a parody, right? So that's an example. It's clearly for farcical purposes and comedy purposes, and then you are kind of protected, but you have to be careful that you're not, competing with the original material in a way. Yeah.
Or else we would have to stop SNL. Yes, they're going to be Saturday night.
That's why they can do whatever they want, or like this great I don't know, like Mel Brooks and other of the great people making parodies or movies of a sketch, and all that. It's a great, that's totally open. You have a right to do it because you're in the parody realm.
Yeah.
What advice do you have for people who are interested in doing adaptations of their own?
Do it because you can help yourself. If you can help yourself, don't do it. Do something else. Don't make yourself crazy. That would be my advice. And be free, I would say. I would recommend be free. Don't feel married in a way, in a bad way to the material, that you cannot do your own thing.
So we've mentioned that, like, you've taught a class, the Poking the Cannon class, and I know that that's a class that you have taught multiple times. One, do you have a class that's coming up? Two, are there any other resources that you would suggest for anyone that's interested, whether green or mid-career level would be interested when it comes to adaptation?
Huge fan of your classes and what you do. I'm gonna say here, because I think for playwrights, and I hope everybody listening are taking your classes already, but I think it's so helpful to block the time to think about issues, to be with other playwrights, to have these discussions, right? To learn and to teach by learning, and learning, by teaching. All this it's enriching. So I'm a big fan of your classes, and there are other places where you can do remote classes now through Chicago Dramatist, but also teaching myself. So I've been the next semesters, I'm going to be very focused on teaching at the university level, which is very rewarding. And I'm going to be at the Paul teaching history of dramatic literature and one. So I love it because it's everything before Shakespeare. And the way I approach that is like, okay, let's look at the classics and let's look at BIPOC queer playwrights who have been in conversation with those classics to see how we can make these more relevant to the artists developing their own practice. And then for Columbia College, I'm teaching playwriting 1, which I love from all my playwriting classes. Playwriting 1 is my favorite because you can see people going from 0, 1, 2 to 100 by the end of the semester. So it's very, very rewarding.
Thank you so much for joining us today and for this wonderful conversation. I hope we'll get you to teach for us again.
In person, I would like to come over.
Ooh, that would be fun.
I would love to come anytime. I think you guys, I mean, you are gold standard of this kind of institution. And as you know, we lost so many of sister institutions around the country during COVID. And I think it's so important what you guys do. This idea of really helping people at all levels of their career is something that I love, because you don't have to be a produced playwright to become a playwright, right? And another thing too, I love that people who already take the step of trying to write a play are pushing back against this idea that we are a group of chosen people. No, excuse me, I was not born knowing how to write a play, or whatever it is. So we can all learn, and I love that about your mission, that you have people from all these levels in conversation, of not levels but stages of their career in conversation, right? I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, we were talking with Stacey Rose a while back, and she said, she spoke to what you just said, that you have to choose yourself. Like that's it. You don't wait for somebody else to knight you or choose you or tell you you're ready to be a playwright and have your play produced. You have to choose yourself every day. And I love that.
I agree.
Well, we've come to the point of the most important question of this entire interview. Where does theater begin for you?
This is Alayna's favorite question. Every time she gets this big grin and she gets excited.
So I have to see the complete sentence. I guess I have to say the complete sentence. So theater begins at birth.
Ooh, I love that. Theater begins in the very beginning. How about for you, Alayna?
As you can see, I have like 50 million different Post-its. That's really brilliant. Yeah. So theater begins when you play with a story that haunts you and leads you to want to heal, explore, and interact with the soul of a play.
Wow.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, Emilio said it.
Well, this idea of thinking what is the soul of the source material is a beautiful question.
Yeah.
So good.
I know that's a tough act to follow.
I know. I'm just sitting here like, didn't you just say it all? I liked what you said about theater. Well, you were talking about adaptation, but theater begins when we talk to the past to reflect on where we've come here in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and theater, like the traditional the theater on the stage is always talking to the past every time we perform it, but also the day-to-day, right? Like we haven't talked about the day-to-day of role playing and the theater of life, and how we have roles given and scripts that we're following and everything else, how theater is everyday life as well. And our lives can be so theatrical at times, and our interactions. So yeah, I love that. I think that inspires me. I love that, Hannah. Inspire me something that maybe I can close with at my end today, is that during COVID, and we're going through such a crisis in theater now, right? And COVID was so tough for our industry and our communities. And I remember we were on a Zoom call for one of the universities, and this famous playwright was freaked out and said, because he had all these world premieres canceled, he said, how can I teach? I'm not going to teach students a kind of theater that may never exist, or, and then I'm like, wait. COVID has survived things much worse than COVID. Okay, we're working on a tradition. So theater is not disappearing. The industry is going to become something else, right? But the theater, that's going to be a change that is a business change in a way. But it's not going to change the core of how you do storytelling and how we move each other, and the importance of being in a room together doing something live that is not Netflix, right? That we can synchronize our heartbeats and be together as a community, looking at and laughing at our miseries and our joys and everything else. That's not going anywhere. There may be less of it, there will be more of it, there may be different of it, but it's not going anywhere. It has survived much worse than COVID.
Thank you for saying that. I feel like I just want to write that down and put it everywhere.
Find ourselves, right?
Yeah, because you're absolutely right.
In many different ways, but more specifically, since the one about going and sitting down in a theater with a stage and all that, since the Athenian traditions before Christ. So I think about all the things that have happened since then, much worse than COVID.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
It's a really hopeful view that I think we need to remind ourselves of more.
Yeah.
It was so great to see you. We should do this more.
Join us for our next episode on September 27th, and let us know on Spotify where theater begins for you. Feel free to send your questions for future episodes to the link in the bio.
Thanks for listening to Playwright Center's Theater Begins Here.